Leader of the third party.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. On March 16th, the Human Rights Commissioner sent a letter to the Provincial Health Officer indicating that the removal of provincial mask mandates places the greatest burden on the most vulnerable in British Columbia. The Premier has publicly stated that COVID-19 is an airborne virus. Masking is one of the least restrictive and most effective ways to mitigate the spread of this virus. The Commissioner said in her letter, quote, "Given the benefits of the mask mandate for thousands of marginalized people and the minimal impact on those who are asked to wear one, the balance at this time favors continuing the mask mandate." The letter states, again, quote, "Lifting the mask mandate will do disproportionate harm to those who are already marginalized." My question, Honourable Speaker, is to the Premier. In a pandemic, what does his government owe to the people and those who live with them who are medically vulnerable or immunocompromised?
Minister of Health.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. In British Columbia, we have, under the Public Health Act, an independent provincial health officer who has worked and done, I think, extraordinary work in the pandemic balancing these very issues. Careful consideration is given to public health measures so that they don't, as you say, interfere in people's behavior more than is necessary by the requirements of the pandemic. And that is what Dr. Henry has done consistently. The decisions around the provincial mask mandate, there was very significant notice given that those were under consideration. In fact, there was some criticism, even here, that we were taking too long to do that. But the provincial health officer gave that due consideration, including all of the questions that the member raises. I would say this, though, that those who are clinically vulnerable have been more the focus of our efforts as a government and as the provincial health officer's efforts than anywhere else in Canada. No one has focused in terms of vaccination on the clinically vulnerable as effectively and as substantively as we have. And we will continue to do that, continue to reflect the evidence, and to continue to support public health in their important decisions to balance these considerations. I very much appreciate the letter from the Human Rights Commissioner, and it's an important point of view to be expressed. But it's a point of view that is not new to the Provincial Health Office, the Provincial Health Officer, and obviously there's some disagreement there between one position and the other, but I can assure her that the focus on the clinically vulnerable will continue to be the principal focus of this government as we continue to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic.
Leader of the third party, supplemental.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And as the Human Rights Commissioner points out, the clinically vulnerable now are deprived of choices. Choices to use public transit, choices to send their children to school, choices to operate in public, because the risk to them is so much greater. The Premier has tasked his government with tackling systemic discrimination. It is in the mandate letter of the Minister of Health. And yet our Human Rights Commissioner has said that the sudden removal of the mask mandate will have profound effects on vulnerable people. She says, quote, "While many of us have the good fortune to simply move on with life, thousands of British Columbians will be left behind because of their age, disability, or other protected characteristics under BC's Human Rights Code." She continues, "The mask mandate is not about eliminating risk. It is about sharing the burden, the risk burden across society, rather than transferring it to a marginalized or medically vulnerable minority." My question, Honourable Speaker, is to the Premier. The Human Rights Commissioner is saying that decisions of this government are harming the most vulnerable people in our province. What is the Premier's response to the Human Rights Commissioner?
Minister of Health.
That we're doing just the opposite. And the evidence over this pandemic demonstrates that. We have given focus from the beginning of the pandemic to those most clinically vulnerable. In long-term care, people who are clinically vulnerable in the community. It's been reflected in every aspect of the COVID-19 response, and it has, because of the ethical values and approach of our Provincial Health Office and our Provincial Health Officer, and the ethical approach we've taken in British Columbia to these questions. And that will continue to be the case. Decisions around restrictions or guidelines are ones that are taken very seriously by the provincial health officer and by our government. Throughout the pandemic, that has been the case, and it continues to be the case. Of course, it is a balance between the impact of measures on people, including all people in BC, of the measures themselves, and I would say the impact of those measures on the pandemic. And that balance has been kept in BC, and the results can be seen in the outcomes we've seen in BC, particularly amongst those clinically vulnerable. I'm very proud of the work done by Dr. Henry in balancing these questions. I continue to be. And since the pandemic is not over by any stretch, we're going to continue to have to do that in the days and the weeks and the months to come.